Hi, my name is Dirk, and I'm here with the amazing Tom Nom Nom to talk about JavaScript. That's what we're going to do today, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we've got like a few things that we probably want to cover.
Yep.
And probably a good place to start would be just a little bit of talk about what JavaScript is. So JavaScript is one of the main languages of the web, and it's the one that makes web pages do things. So we have like HTML, which describes what web page, how it's structured. We've got CSS, which describes what it looks like, what the colors are like, and all that sort of thing. And then JavaScript, which is kind of, it's not really a description, but it's a programming language that we use to make web pages actually do interesting stuff, like talk to servers, or make things dance around the page, or make things change when you click on them, and all that kind of thing. Form handling, all that validation stuff that you want to do, all kinds of things. And like these days, people build whole apps with just JavaScript, and we call those like single page applications, right?
Yeah.
And they're like big news these days. People use big frameworks like React, and it all gets really super complicated.
But it's not to be confused with Java.
No, definitely not. So, like, there's a bit of a story behind that. I'm not sure how much of it is true. But when I think Brendan Ike, I think his name is, when he was creating JavaScript, Java was just getting really popular, and some of his like bosses said, "Hey, we should call it JavaScript to like capitalize on the success of Java," and so they did. Hence, confusing generations upon generations of newbie programmers.
Cool. Okay, so what we're going to learn today is, as an attacker, why should we look at JavaScript? And what can we do to leverage that to find vulnerabilities? Tools, how to find them, and primarily also, basics. Like, how do you get started? How do you understand what's going on? And actually, how can you take that information that you got into exploiting it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool.
So I thought a good place to start would be, let's have a look at Yahoo.
Yes.
Just yahoo.com, and have a look at the JavaScript that's on there from an attacker's perspective.
Sweet.
And actually, one of the most useful tools I've found for doing this kind of thing is, and probably one of the most underrated hacker tools that there is at all, is the Chrome DevTools.
Oh, yeah.
So I use the keyboard shortcut to open these, but if you're more of a fan of clicking around, you can click these three dots up here, go to More Tools, and then Developer Tools, and you'll get the same thing. So the Chrome DevTools are, in theory at least, they were made for developers, but it's super useful for us hackers too. So for a start, if I go to the Network tab here and reload the page in the background, I can see all of the requests that are being loaded in this page, and I can filter them to just the JavaScript files that are being loaded. So we can see there's quite a lot of them.
Just one click?
Yeah.
Cool. Because I'm not really using Chrome DevTools at all. I'm a burp user, so primarily has to do that. I love proxies, right? But this is actually proxying the traffic the same way, right?
Yeah, kind of. So I mean, like, I use burp too, and it is useful. I find that like this view in particular gives me a lot of advantages, but also the viewing facilities that I get on these are much better. So I can pick on one of these files. Let's just pick one randomly, and I can get an overview of the headers that were sent and the headers that I got back with the request. But I can also right-click it and go to Open in Sources Panel. So the Sources Panel is kind of a nice place to be able to view JavaScript and do some funky things with it. I tend not to that much, but
I tend not to.
But one of the things that you can do is you can deal with this horrible all-in-one-line minified JavaScript by hitting this button down here. That if you hover over it, you can see it says Pretty Print.
Oh.
So if you click that, you get a much nicer formatted version of it.
That's nice.
So, like, if you're viewing this in burp, I think there might be some JavaScript beautifier plugins, maybe, but if it's a minified file, you're going to have a hard time actually reading it and trying to understand.
It's terrible. It's really terrible.
It is really, really bad. There's a variety of reasons that we want to read this file. So one of which is we just want to know like what behavior is happening in the page.
Yeah.
But another thing is like we want to go in here and search for like maybe there's some API keys or something in there. So we might want to like hit Control F and search for secret, and hopefully we're not going to find anything in there because it's the homepage of Yahoo or any other keywords that you want to search through.
If you wanted to search for endpoints in here, what would you do then? Search for /API or?
Yeah, so I think that's kind of like the low tech way to do it, or like the lowest tech. Is you can just sort of say, let's see, do I find anything for /API? And in this case, I don't.
No.
But if you remember on that network tab, this is all the JavaScript files that were loaded, but also related to JavaScript is this one labeled XHR. And if I hover over it, you can see it says XHR and fetch.
What does that mean?
So XHR is XML HTTP request, which is a silly name for what became known as AJAX, or fetching remote files with JavaScript.
Okay.
And it's because of Microsoft that it's called that, basically. But if we click this tab, we can see these requests were ones that were made by JavaScript. So and you can in fact see, for a start, the initiator, so what it was that actually launched this request. If we go and hit pretty print, it'll take us to this line of JavaScript here was the one that initiated that request.
Oh, so it does that for us.
Yeah, so we can kind of work backwards and say, like, well, here's an API call, like to this weather location service, right? I can go straight to the initiator of that. And once I've done that, I can use that knowledge to say, okay, well, you know, what else is in this file around here? So if there's one API call there, maybe there's going to be others. Also, I might just pick on the name of it as well. So this says, well, weather location service. And one of the other things the DevTools provides you is a search functionality. So I'm going to hit escape, and I'm going to search for that weather location service. And you can see this is pretty quick as well. So I can click on the result, and it's going to take me straight to the sources tab.
Let's beautify it.
I can pretty print it. And it hasn't put me in the right place, but I know what it was I was searching for. It was weather location service. And I can read around this JavaScript and say, okay, well, they're making a requests object here. So maybe I'm going to go and search for requests in this JavaScript file or in all of the other JavaScript files. If there are more API calls, they're probably going to be in a similar format. But just searching for /API, that's going to work some of the time, but that's not always where APIs are, right? Sometimes it's /v1, or sometimes it's /YQL or something on Yahoo, right? That's one way that the DevTools can be really useful, is this kind of what I would call static analysis of JavaScript code, which just means reading JavaScript code, really. Where it can be more useful, and another reason that we want to read JavaScript is because there can be vulnerabilities in JavaScript itself. So you ever heard of DOM-XSS?
Yep.
So DOM-XSS.
What is that though?
So I think it would be better called client-side XSS, or maybe even JS XSS, but that's a little bit of a mouthful, right? So the general idea is, rather than like a value being reflected in the page, like with a reflected XSS, or being stored with a stored XSS, this is purely JavaScript is taking some data from the user, and it's mishandling it in a way that lets us execute JavaScript. So one of the things that got introduced a while back was an ability for different web pages to talk to each other using a thing called post message, right? And web pages will have these post message handlers or listeners that are listening out for these events. And if you take a web page like this, there is so much JavaScript in here. It, like, finding the particular part that's handling that particular event is going to be really tricky, but Chrome DevTools helps us out again. So I'm going to click over in the global listeners part of the sources tab over here. And I can see this is a list of all of the event listeners that are registered on this page, and one of them is message. So if I click that, I can see there's two things here. So if I click on the file name of that one, it's going to take me to this like horrible minified file again, but I can click the pretty print again. And not only is it going to format the JavaScript, but it's going to take me right to this particular function that's the one that's handling post message events. But one thing I want to point out here is this is really hard to read, this function, because although we pretty printed the file, the variable names are still all single letters, and it's really difficult to read and follow what the hell is going on here. So we're going to use another feature of the DevTools here to help us out.
Perfect. Because me as a non-code person,
like
I don't get that at all.
Reading code is hard at the best of times. And this has been made like just one extra step harder. I'm going to click one of the line numbers here. I'm going to say click this one down here, 5530. I'm going to hit escape a couple of times and bring up the console. Now the console lets us run any JavaScript that we want. And in this case, I'm going to call window.postMessage, And this takes two arguments, which it tells us right here, in fact, the message and the target origin. So we know that post message is just a standard JavaScript function that exists in any web page. It's something that the browser provides. And the way it usually works is, if I have like an iframe in my page, I would get a reference to its window object and call the post message. But for now, I just want to send a post message so I can hit this thing that I've set here, which is called a breakpoint. So I'm going to pick just any piece of text. Give me a piece of, what word are we going to put in here? Just something random.
Mail?
Mail. Okay, that works. And then the second argument is the target. And in that, we're just going to put a star. So it means any target. If I run that, you can see I've got a message up here that says paused in debugger. And that's because this is the message handler. I sent a message to it, and this breakpoint has told the Chrome DevTools, hey, when this line of code runs, you need to stop and give control over to the DevTools. And suddenly you can see we've got a lot of extra information here. So we can see this message event, and the data is set to mail. And we can see on the next line what all of these other variables get set to. So we can see here the E variable gets set to mail. And we've got another view in the scope section over here of all of the different values of the variables too. And I find this really useful for working my way backwards through the code. And I can see further on that my data is passed to this function P. And if I hover over it, I can see it's telling me where that function is defined. And I can click it and be taken straight to this function. It's got a different name here even. Because of the way JavaScript works, things might get assigned to different names and so on as they get passed around through different functions. So like if I want to
keep track.
Yeah, so if I was trying to do like a static analysis, reading the code and trying to figure it out just as a human with my fallible, squishy brain, this would be really hard. But here it's taken me right there. And I can read this code and figure it out. The debugger and the breakpoints really, really help us out in that respect, because we can inspect the actual values of things at runtime, and you can actually modify them as well. You can execute code in the console in the context of this function. So if I type a T down in the console here, I can see it's doing what's called eager evaluation, showing me the value of this thing. And I can refer to t.data, which is my mail value. And I can interact with this stuff and change the values of variables while the code is paused, and then continue it and see what happens.
What kind of bugs would you be looking for? Would it be XXSs or would it be...
Yeah, usually. So should we have a look at a vulnerable
for sure.
post message?
Absolutely.
Thing?
Give me vulnerable one.
So because the law exists, we can't just go showing vulnerable things on Yahoo.com.
No, we can't.
But as luck would have it, Google released this thing called firing range, and this is a public instance of it. And this is a whole set of pages that are vulnerable in a bunch of different ways. And we can see one of these things is DOM-XSS. There's a whole list of different things in here, and they're categorized by where the data source is. This would be DOM-XSS where the value comes from a cookie, where it comes from a referrer or the window name. But the one I'm interested in here is this post message eval one. So we've got an empty page, but let's pull open the DevTools, and we can see here the JavaScript is in line with the HTML, but the prettify still works. And we can see there's a post message handler being added as an event listener for message events on the window object. We can set a breakpoint here.
This is way easier to read though than the other one.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Like this has not been minified or obfuscated or anything like that.
Even I can understand this.
We can try sending our same post message again, and we can see we're paused in the debugger. If I set a breakpoint on the next line, content is now set to mail, but I can change it. So let's change it to alert document.domain, and then continue with the debugger. And we can see we've got an alert window, public firing range.appspot.com. So I know now, having figured this out interactively, that actually my post message can just be alert document.domain.
Cool. Let's play around with the idea that you would show impact.
Okay.
What would you do?
It depends a lot on the target.
For sure.
And it's worth pointing out that sometimes the impact really is nothing, because like this is a really good example here. This is a property owned by Google, public firing range.appspot.com, and I've got XSS on this domain. I can run any JavaScript I want, but there's no impact because there's nothing here to be stolen. There's nothing here to be taken. And people talk about the impact of XSS as being like, oh, I can steal cookies, but you know, we have HTTP only flags on cookies now, and that's not really the main issue. The main issue is you've bypassed what's called the same origin policy, which is the main protection browsers have to stop JavaScript from just going off and doing whatever it wants. JavaScript on, say, evil.com, fetching your banking website, right? The same origin policy says, no, that's not allowed. But if I can run JavaScript on your banking website, I can do anything that you can do on your banking website just by clicking around. So if you've got standing transfers or things set up, or withdrawals to different accounts, or whatever it is, if you can do it by clicking, JavaScript can do it too. That's the real impact. So look for those things. Let's look at this complex message, and we can view the page source of it, or we can use the dev tools, since that's what we've been talking about.
Yes.
And one thing I haven't really mentioned yet is this elements view, which can be also really useful because JavaScript can manipulate the HTML in the page. And when you view source, you're viewing the HTML that was sent by the server. But if it's since been manipulated by the JavaScript, it's now different to that. The elements view, on the other hand, gives you the current view of the HTML with all of those manipulations applied. So if I hit expand recursively on here, you can see here's the full HTML with the JavaScript in it, and here's our post message handler. It's a little bit more complicated this time, but I'm sure we'll be able to come up with an exploit for it. So
you think?
Yeah, I think I've had enough practice at this point.
I think so too. All right, let's get it.
Let's have a look at the code,
yep.
And see really what it's going to be expecting from us. So we have the message,
yep.
Is the thing that we're sending, and data is the bit that we actually control. So this is looking for an action and comparing it to the word exec and saying, if action is equal to exec, I'm going to evaluate the contents of message.data.payload. So what we actually want here is an object, and it wants two things in it. It wants an action, which is going to be exec, and it wants a payload, which will use the alert. And now I do to stick to alerting document domain as my kind of go-to, and that's because having the document.domain tells me automatically and for sure what it is that's really running this JavaScript, which is nice. That's our kind of standard proof of concept. But as we said, we can't really put that in a bug bounty report. So I'm going to rely on another little tool called Replit. And Replit is really useful. It lets you write code in a web browser in a variety of different languages, like Python, or C, or Node.js, or Java, not to be confused with JavaScript. But it will also let us write HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And rather than like having my own server set up and all that sort of thing, it's really nice to be able to just quickly fire this thing up and use this instead. This is the page I'm trying to exploit. And what I'm going to do is make an iframe with an ID of, say, target. And this is the iframe that I'm going to load that page in. And I'm going to click in the script.js, and we're going to use the JavaScript to write our actual exploit. The first thing I'm going to do is kind of get a handle on that iframe element, as it were, so the target. And I'm going to use document.getElement by ID to do that. And then we're going to add an event listener to it. And that's going to be a load event listener. So when that iframe has finished loading its contents, we are going to run this code. The code we're going to run, target.contentWindow, which is the equivalent of the window object that we were using before, and the post message, same as it was before. And we're going to go back to the console and grab the arguments that we used there, because
so
we know those work. We've tested them already.
For sure.
Okay, there we go. I'm going to set the source of that iframe to be this page.
Yep.
And in theory, if I hit run up here, we should get an alert. Here we go, public firing range.appspot.com. So we know that it's definitely firing in the right context.
Yes.
And we can hit open in a new tab here, and we've got a publicly accessible address with a random name that we could send this to a bug bounty program or something like that, and say, here's my explanation and here's my proof of concept. And it won't affect your original. It makes like a a fork of it if they start to edit it. But it means that they can very easily inspect everything that's
So as a proof of concept, this is a very easy way to show that, okay, so if I'm running this externally, this is what's going to happen.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, that's cool. Okay, cool. So we learned how to create a simple POC, right? And how to play around with the console and some basic tools to just get started and play around with JavaScript. So in your humble opinion, when it comes to JavaScript, why would an attacker invest time in looking for stuff in JavaScript and not just, brute force stuff?
Yeah, so I think really it comes down to a few things for me. One that we've kind of covered, which is there can be vulnerabilities in the JavaScript itself.
Yeah.
Another, which is sometimes there are bits of secret information leaked in there. It's not super common, but it does happen and it's worth looking for.
Yeah.
Well, the other one is increasingly the JavaScript files are really a description of how the web application works.
Yeah.
All of its inputs and outputs, all of the interactions that can happen with it, all of the endpoints that exist.
Yeah.
Sometimes there'll still be some things that are hidden and they need to be brute forced because they're not in use or they're old. But really, you can save a lot of time by reading the JavaScript file instead of going off and brute forcing things instead. And a lot of the times you'll find things that you just could not have brute forced. That weather API endpoint that we were having a look at before, for example, that's probably not in your word list. It's not in mine.
No, definitely.
But it could have been really interesting. And even if we had have found it, we still need to know about its inputs and its outputs. And usually the first step in exploiting something is making it work the way it's supposed to work first. Because if you can't do that, it's really hard to make it do something it's not supposed to do.
And it's easy for developers to forget things. We're all stressed, right? And I've seen scenarios where you're actually, when you're looking through the JavaScript, the application itself looks totally normal. But when you start looking into the JavaScript, you can see the references that are happening inside the JavaScript, the things that it's calling for. It's searching for data from the database, and it turns it out into a JSON file, and it's littered with creds, more or less. It's just dumping it in clear text when you send the request in. But you would never find that if you didn't read the JavaScript and see that request going in. And
one of the other things I've come across a few times in the past is all of the JavaScript for an application is bundled into one thing. It's all in one file, it's all minified. But the application includes all of the admin functionality that you're not supposed to be able to see. They don't want to have multiple JavaScript bundles for the admin application and for the regular customer-facing application. So it all goes into one because that's kind of the path of least resistance. So you can learn about that admin functionality.
You're not seeing it now, but you can play around with it then.
Absolutely.
And then just by simple doing a match and replace in burp, you can sometimes get the answer coming back and showing you in your browser parts of what you weren't supposed to see. You're still not having that access, but you can see the design and layout, what it would look like, and start to figure things out.
Definitely.
And if you're using tools like, let's say, Wayback URLs or something else, you can look at older versions of the same code and find stuff that's been changed.
Absolutely, it can. Absolutely. In particular, I like to go back and look at the first versions of applications because they're the ones where, everything was rushed out the door. The developers had probably been working late nights, and they took shortcuts for sure. We should really have a password vault with all of our secrets and API keys and things that's all set up properly.
We're stressed, didn't release tomorrow.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're just going to push it out the door with the API key in the JavaScript file. And it got removed the next day, but the crawlers and the Wayback Machine, they were there and they saw it. So definitely worth looking at for sure.
Cool. Okay. Thank you very much for going through JavaScript with me.
Always a pleasure, my friend.
Have a good one.
Always a pleasure.